name correctly. I'm just sort of moderating the whole PhD process, which means I have a look that everything is done according to the rules of a PhD process. I think there will be a presentation first by Aibek and then comments by the two main reviewers. And I will see that everybody keeps the time and that we finish in time accordingly. After that, there will be the committee will go into a breakout room, I guess, and discuss how the exam went according to them, and also link this then to the mark of the thesis. After that, Aibek will be invited to return and will be presented with the result of the two supervisors of the thesis. So that's the process, and I'm actually here to guarantee a fair process, that everything goes according to rule. And with this, I think I leave the floor now to Aibek for a presentation. Or Jean, would you like to add something?
No, thank you very much. I think we give Aibek the floor for 30 minutes. We just tested the presentation.
Thank you, Professor Haller. Thank you, Professor Trevisani and Professor Féaux for all your support and all your comments and help over the course of the last 8.5 years. Your help was very important and instrumental for where we stand at the moment. So today, I would like to talk about livelihoods and social environmental change in the Syr Darya Delta, adaptive strategies and practices. As mentioned before, my name is Aibek Samakov, for those who may not know me, and I am a PhD student at the University of Bern. We do not assume that everyone is familiar where Kazakhstan is and where the Syr Darya Delta is. And Syr Darya Delta is in Kazakhstan, which is the largest country in Central Asia. And you can see my research site highlighted in red here. So you can see the remnants of the Aral Sea. And you can see that it used to be it used to be the fourth largest inland lake in the world, but over the course of 20th century, from 1960s, it shrunk to 10% of its original size. And you may have heard of Aral Sea catastrophe because it was quite a notorious handmade catastrophe. It was in the news. It was taken up by UN. Etc. And it's often heralded as one of the worst human-made, man-made catastrophes in the world. And on top right corner, you can see how the lake actually shrunk. So you can see how it was quite full, and then at the bottom right, you can see that it shrunk to 10% of its original size. So that's where my research site is, in Kazakhstan. And I'd also like to acknowledge that my research was part of the larger project called the Social Life of the River, Environmental History, Social Worlds, and Conflict Resolution along the Syr Darya River. And there were 5 people who did their field work along the Syr Darya River. And we've been constantly in touch. We've been co-working and we've been cross-pollinating. And a lot of ideas that I have presented in my thesis are a result of this fruitful cooperation with the team. And I'd also like to thank the Volkswagen Stiftung that funded our team while we were at the University of Tübingen. And if we come to the actual meat of the research, what we are going to talk about today is the environmental change. So we are going to talk about how the environment has changed in the Syr Darya Delta. And as the other side of the coin with the change, there's always an adaptation or adaptive strategy. So we will talk about how the change, what kind of responses there was to that change. And in order to actually have some empirical data to talk about both change and adaptation, I chose the livelihoods lens. So I will be talking a lot about the livelihoods of Syr Darya Delta communities, of what they do, how they make living. and how that how the livelihoods are impacted by the environmental change. There are the research questions, of course, and you can see they're color-coded. So in order to answer the question about the change, I asked what drove the environmental change in the Syr Darya Delta. In order to answer the question about the adaptation, I asked how did Delta residents adapt their livelihoods in response to the environmental change? And in order to respond to the livelihoods question, I asked, what are the livelihoods of the Syr Darya Delta inhabitants? I don't know who the mic is on, so whoever has both rights, I think you can mute the somebody who's talking. Well, yeah, sorry, I'm pretty sure it's. I'm pretty sure it's also quite interesting, but we can talk about it later. So sorry. And then here I also would like to give you a very short introduction to my thesis structure, and my presentation structure follows closely the thesis structure. And with my chapters 3 and 4 are related to this change aspect, environmental change aspect of my work. And in those chapters, I'm just giving you a foreshadowing of what's going to be in the chapter. I will be talking about the concept of iconic places, the concept that was developed by Dr. Féaux de la Croix, and I will be building on this concept and introducing some of the new elements to this concept, such as iconic species and iconic forces. When it comes to livelihoods, I have several chapters dedicated to livelihoods, and in chapter 5, I described how herding, reed mowing, fishing, and gardening are done in the Syr Darya Delta, and one of the findings was that the livelihoods in the Syr Darya Delta are run as common pool resources. And later on, I'll also explain very briefly what the common pool resources are. In chapter 6, I looked at the concept, very famous concept of the tragedy of the commons and the design principles. And I asked myself the question why the tragedy of the commons didn't happen in the Syr Darya Delta. And in chapter 7, I looked at cooperation and collective action, which is also quite a popular debate in the commons literature and beyond. And I also talked about commoning, which is looking at commons more from a process side as more of a dynamic things. And in chapter 8, I also have a description of tasadduk, sacrifice ritual, and how it helps commoning and enables commons in the Syr Darya Delta. And for the third one, for the adaptation part, I look at commonization as an adaptive strategy, as well as specific adaptive strategies in agriculture in relation to gardening. So this is the rough thesis structure, as well as presentation structure, and we'll be coming back to this slide every now and then to see to give you a heads up on where we are in the presentation. Now, I'd like to briefly tell you about my research methods. Oops, sorry. So I used, you can see the research site, a zoomed up version of the research site on the map in the left bottom corner. I did both ethnographic field work, which was a backbone of my research, but in addition to my ethnographic studies, I also did a little bit of archival studies, archival research, which was a bit unusual for the anthropologist, and for me it was a very new experience. So for my ethnographic data, I stayed 12 months in the Syr Darya Delta. In 2016-2017, I visited more than 14 villages, and I stayed in 7 villages most of my time. I engaged with livelihood activities, meaning that I did everything that local families were doing. Would it be mowing reed, fishing, gardening, etc. I attended a lot of feasts and celebrations called As and Toy. So Kazakh people were very friendly, and I attended a lot of those, and I conducted over 100 semi-structured interviews. Most of my respondents were men, and very few women. So this is a bit something that I need to point out. And as for the archives, I spent 2 months in 2017 in 4 archives. You can see that 2 in Almaty, 3 in Almaty, and 1 in Kızılorta. And the documents that I engaged with were from 1938, 1975. I wanted to look it up all the way up to 90. However, the documents were missing. And you can see the number of folders examined. So it is roughly over 200 folders that I looked through over this 2 months of archival research. And here are some pictures from my archival, from my field site. So on the left, you can see how I am participating in the Tasatep ritual. So we just slaughtered a calf and we were loading it. You can see how we were fishing, and then you can see the excerpts from the archives. The one on the right is about the Kazali dam, which is very important in the Syr Darya Delta, and the one is about how this dam was being built. So you can see the piece of correspondence. You can also see that I also participated in mowing reed. It was a very hard and tough and challenging physical work, and also in herding, but all of it was very much worth it because it gave me a very close and intimate look into the livelihoods lens. And that's why I'm using livelihood lens to talk about environmental change and adaptation. Now, if we come to this first part of my thesis, as I mentioned before, now we're going to start talking about change. And when you talk about change, so the question is how how can we perceive or understand environmental change in the Syr Darya Delta? And in order to do that, I take the notion of iconic places, and iconic places are the places that inspire a certain degree of reverence. They're recognizable beyond that region. They are places that matter, the places that someone has opinion on and relationship with, and those places which are used as shorthands. And if you look at the Syr Darya Delta, you can see that there are there are two iconic places in the Syr Darya Delta, and they come up a lot in colloquial speech, in proverbs, in jokes, etc. And these are called Syr and Qyr. So Syr, you can see on the left this lush green reed bed, and Qyr is the semi-desert pasture of Karakum semi-desert, which is north of Syr Darya River, north of Syr Darya Delta. And traditionally, Syr was a wintering ground for the livestock, and Qyr was the summer pasture. And in Féaux de la Croix work, the pastures that she looks at in Kyrgyzstan are the summer pastures, summer jailos. And in that sense, it was very easy to use this concept in Syr Darya Delta as well, because here you see summer pastures and winter pastures, both of them being very iconic. And if you ask me where the Syr ends, when the Qyr starts, the Syr iconic place extends as far as the floodplains extend, or as far as the waters from Syr Darya are taken through the canals to irrigate rice fields or gardens, etc. And Qyr is where this dry pastures start. And in the Syr, the main source of water is the river, whereas in Qyr, the main source is the water from the wells. And you can see that in colloquial speech, they often use Syr and Qyr as shorthand for describing people. They say, "Oh, I'm a Syr person, that's why I'm such and such," or sometimes they say, "I'm Qyr person, that's why I'm such and such." So this distinction between Syr and Qyr are used to describe people, to describe livelihoods, to describe preferences, etc. And they're also used in proverbs. For example, there's a very famous proverb saying "Sırda mingbale, qırda mingbale," which means there's 1,000 curses in Syr and 1 curse in Syr, and it refers mostly in the context of herding to a lot of ticks, mosquitoes close to the riparian areas, where the main enemy of the livestock in the Qyr pastures were the wolves. So you can clearly see that Syr and Qyr are the iconic places, and but when looking at these iconic places, it was you could say that, you know, this flux of the extension of Syr into Qyr happens when the irrigation infrastructure is extended, and when it deteriorates, Qyr expands back into Syr. However, with this notion of iconic places, I realized that it wasn't serving me well to explain the environmental change in the Syr Darya Delta. And that's why I introduced two more concepts, one of each, which being the iconic species. So during my archival research, I realized that a lot of environmental change in the Syr Darya Delta, a lot of fluxes of waxing and waning of Syr and Qyr iconic places happened because of rice. So just like cotton was a very instrumental species for or product for driving environmental change in upper stretches of Syr Darya, rice was the species that drove the building of large-scale infrastructure of canals and other things in the and dikes in the Syr Darya Delta. That's why I show that rice is an iconic species that inhabits these iconic places, and that's why it gives us its momentum and dynamism. Besides that, I also introduced the concept of iconic forces, which also gives some dynamism to the iconic places, and those iconic forces in Syr Darya Delta are water scarcity and water abundance, because if you look at archival research and oral history, all infrastructural development was done to prevent floods and to counteract water scarcity. So long story short, so if we come back to the original notion of change, environmental change in Syr Darya has been happening for a long time. And lately it was, if you look at it from the local perspective, it's the change is conceptualized as interactions between these two iconic places. And what makes this iconic places dynamic is the iconic species and iconic forces. And when we come to local livelihoods, are they thriving commons? So as I mentioned in the beginning, you can see this blue circle, and there are 4 chapters that deal with livelihoods in the Syr Darya Delta. And I should point out that the rural livelihoods that I looked at are not the only livelihoods in the Syr Darya Delta. Of course, there are wage jobs, so there are governmental jobs at schools, at kindergartens, at like transportation companies, etc. There's also long distance jobs called vachta, which are also one of the main sources of income. There are also rice corporations which are run privately. However, in my research, I focused on this green bubble where we talk about herding, reed harvesting, fishing, etc. So by no means the livelihoods that I look at are exclusive or encompass everything in the Syr Darya Delta. So if I walk you through the livelihoods of an average family in the Syr Darya Delta, almost every family has some livestock, and the majority of livestock is sheep and goats and cattle. The richer families have horses, and even those who are even richer, they have camels. Another main source of livelihoods is the reed beds and harvesting reeds. So this one is summer reed called pshen in local language, and this summer reed is used as feed for animals. And the winter reed, which is harvested again, obviously in winter, is used as construction materials. Here you can see how versatile it is. It's used for fences, it's used for building houses, etc. Besides that, the gardening, they call it bahcha gardening, which is mostly the shifting agriculture for growing melons, watermelons, and other vegetables. Here on the top right, you can see a small watermelon sprout, melon sprout, and on the left you can see the harvest, which we collected in August and September. So some of those melons were planted by me, actually. And then, of course, there's fishing, and this fishing is done on the canals, in the river itself, and in the small water bodies. However, like I didn't put too much information about fishing in my thesis, because there was a bit of a risk for my respondents, because all the fishing was technically illegal. That's why I was a bit cautious about drawing too much on fishing. Tragedy of the commons. So if you ask me what the commons are, so commons are the rivalrous and finite resources. So if using, there are two criteria called subtractability and excludability, but what you need to understand is that if a resource is rivalrous, meaning that different people want to use it at the same time, and it's finite, then it's a common pool resource. So one thing I've noted was that I asked, what are the rules for sharing commons in the Syr Darya Delta? And the main answer was that everyone, for example, if we take reed, mows as much reed as one wants. And secondly, if you are not allowed to mow the area only if somebody is already taking it. However, this doesn't meet the definition of managed commons. If from the literature you can ask the question, are these open access resources, and isn't it an ideal recipe for the tragedy of the commons? Because if everyone takes as much as one wants, then it should inevitably lead to the tragedy of the commons, as Hardin predicted. However, it's not as simple, it's nuanced, and as Haller 2020 pointed out in his paper, that open access might actually occur temporarily during a season, but it doesn't occur during all times and everywhere. So this was pretty much what I also found in the Syr Darya Delta. Although the basic rules state that it's open access, and the open access part happens only in certain places and only in certain times. Then what I did was that I compared the conditions, like how the commons are run in the Syr Darya Delta against institutional design principles developed by Ostrom, and most of the principles were there. And one of the interesting things were about permeability and flexibility of, for example, group and resource boundaries. So, for example, my research found that the boundaries of the group do not exclude, for example, non-human beings like badgers or crows or other animals that may steal harvest from you. They're actually seen as, by the majority of commoners, as also legitimate commoners. Other things I also looked at was that besides these institutional design principles that show that this is why tragedy of the commons didn't happen in the Syr Darya Delta, there's also Dasgupta's old model, economic model, that shows why the tragedy of the commons did not happen in the Syr Darya Delta. And he claims that even if the resource is open access, if it's renewability and if it's high cost for extraction, then there's no tragedy. And in the case of commons in the Syr Darya Delta, all of them are renewable, and extraction is usually high cost. Besides that, there's also effects, emotions, and subjectivity. There's a literature showing, and my fieldwork shows, that people do not just treat their reed beds, their pastures as resource. They actually have emotional and affective attachment to it, and that's another reason why the tragedy of the commons didn't happen. And the third one, environmental and social constraints. What I am arguing is that, in Hardin's parable, he says everyone will be incentivized to put an additional head of livestock on the pasture. But if you look at it from the local gardener's perspective, local herder's perspective, it's actually really hard to put an additional head on the pasture, because they can be eaten by predators. Your relative may die, and you may have to give it to your livestock to be slaughtered. So it's not that easy to keep putting an additional livestock on the pasture. So there are some environmental and social constraints. When it comes to cooperation and collective action, I found that there were several interesting findings. First of all, the same communities that have has reed beds, that has fishing grounds, that has gardens, and that do herding, they may cooperate and may be very cooperative with one another when it comes to one commons, one resource, and they can be very uncooperative when it comes to another commons. And the literature explains that there should be, in order for people to start cooperating, there should be feasible improvement from cooperation, there should be predictability of the resource flow, and then there should be this resource should be important for the local communities, right? So, and it's not, these criteria are not all of them. So actually there are a few more, but they were not applicable for my case. But indeed, this criteria for both resource and for the community actually explained this variability in cooperation across commons. However, besides that, I also found that even within a single commons, for example, bahçe gardening, when growing melons, there's a different level, different degree of cooperation across various stages of the same resource extraction, right? Which I call a commoning process. So, for example, if you look at the growing melons, in the very beginning, when they select land, when they put fences up, when they do the plowing and sowing, there's more cooperation. And as the process evolves, there's less and less and less cooperation. At one moment, the common pool resource actually can be seen as a patchwork of of privately owned plots. But again, at the time of the harvest, it becomes again commonized more. So this was one of my key findings, that the difference in cooperation, it doesn't exist not only across resources but also within the resource throughout the process of commoning or engaging, negotiating, and using a certain resource. Then I have attended a sacrifice ritual called tasaddık. So here you can see how a calf being slaughtered, and every community does it in the spring. And I claim that this tasaddık ritual, so it happens in every community. In every community, it happens in a slightly different way, but as I said, it always happens in spring. It's very communal, so everyone contributes to it, and everyone must taste whatever was cooked at tasaddık. And in all tasaddıks, actually, rice is being cooked, which is an iconic species that I talked about earlier. And here you can see this group of people serving rice and how they're eating. And why I'm saying that tasaddık sacrifice ritual is important is because, for example, Singh in her 2017 paper conceptualized commoning, or this process of engaging with commons or living the commons, is an effective socio-nature relations. So she is saying that commons sites of effective encounters between humans and more than human material world, as well as practices that nurture these relationships. So as I said, in the institutional and neo-institutional approach to commons, this affective side, this subjective side, is often overlooked, and that's why the very fact that there's this ritual shows that tasaddık is very important for enabling the commons and commoning process in the Syr Darya Delta. And one of the ways it enables enables the commoning process in Syr Darya Delta is through reinforcing kinship, friendship, and other social ties, such as there's klasdaşlar, those people who studied together, kurdaşlar, people of the same age, and other small, like or the links between neighbors in the neighborhoods. So all this friendship, kinship, and other social ties are reinforced through tasaddık ritual, and those kinship ties, they actually fundamental for common institutions unfolding in the Syr Darya Delta. So now we're coming to the last part of my thesis, and it's about the adaptation. So here, I will be talking about the commonization as an overarching adaptive strategy, and I'll also be going into the specific adaptive strategies in agriculture. So what I found was that commonization was an adaptive strategy for a rapid social environmental change in the Syr Darya Delta. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where government backed economy collapsed, and the kolkhozes and sovkhozes in the Syr Darya Delta collapsed, most of the lands which were used by kolkhozes, sovkhozes, they were abandoned, and the local community started using them as common pool resources. So in other words, the state-owned lands turned into commons, and that's why it was commonization was one of the key adaptive strategies. At the same time, we shouldn't say that commonization was the only adaptive strategy. The privatization was happening alongside commonization. So, and as a result, you can see that rice corporations are run privately, and bahçe gardens and others are run as common pool resources. So, as Nayak and Berkes 2021, they mentioned that commons and commonization and decommonization, or commonization and privatization, all these processes often happen at the same time. They're often concurrent, and they should be two-way or multi-way processes. Why the commonization happened in the Syr Darya Delta? First of all, they didn't appear out of blue. They existed there. The commons institutions were marginal during the Soviet times. So the areas that kolkhozes didn't use were used by local communities as commons. So what happened is when kolkhozes collapsed, these commons institutions from the margins expanded to the whole area. And the other thing is that kinship, friendship, and other social networks that could enable commonization was strong, and that's why the commonization as an adaptive strategy actually happened in the Syr Darya Delta. And if you look at the agricultural specific adaptive strategies, you can see that shifting agriculture is a overarching adaptive strategy which is used both by rice corporation and local farmers. And if you look at the bahçe gardeners, they rely a lot on their local soil knowledge, which comprises a very rich knowledge of soil salinity, where they distinguish between black and white soil, local irrigation practices, which is their version or different version of, or an alternative to drip irrigation, and although it uses much more water than drip irrigation. And they coexist with this so-called agronomic knowledge, with like scholarly knowledge, which talks about crop rotation, fertilizers, and improving the drainage infrastructure, etc. So if we come back to my entire thesis, you could see that it consists of these three parts, where again, there's environmental change happening in the Syr Darya Delta. Then there are livelihoods that live in this environment of change, and then there's this adaptive strategies. So what I wanted to show is that these three elements are so interlinked and so interconnected with one another that I had to use all these three different approaches to explain how the social and environmental change was happening in the Syr Darya Delta. And just to give you a short recap of what we talked about today is that Syr Darya Delta has been an area of rapid social environmental change, and this change can be seen as the interaction of iconic places of Syr and Qyr. The interaction of these iconic places was happening through the iconic species and iconic forces, such as water scarcity and floods. The adaptive strategies, one of the overarching adaptive strategy was the commonization of resources, but again, it didn't happen just on its own. So the privatization was happening alongside it, but it was beyond the scope of my thesis. And if you look at the specific adaptive strategies for doing agriculture in such a harsh environment, there's a bunch of smaller adaptive strategies that can go under the shifting agriculture. And I came to all these conclusions through looking at local livelihoods such as herding, reed mowing, gardening, and fishing, which all of them are run as common pool resources. And through my research, I showed that the common pool resource, the case of commons in the Syr Darya Delta, they not only they live up to the debates in the current commons literature, but they also push it beyond by showing that the non-human beings can also be seen as commoners, and also placing more emphasis on commoning as a continuous process of engaging with a particular process. So that was my research. Of course, there's a lot of things that I didn't manage to cover in my presentation. However, I'd like to thank again my examiners and our chair today, and everyone who joined us today for taking your time. And thank you very much for your comments, for your thoughts. And I hope that with the help of your fruitful comments, we can make this work more intellectually stimulating. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation, Aibek.